Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're going to let people funnel in real quick. It's just going to be for the next 3 minutes, but I'm very happy to be joined by these esteemed panelists. How's everyone feeling about tomorrow? The great thing about being in the state of California is that at least we could focus on here for just a little bit. Anyway, and Graciela, we have a message in the chat for you. Hello, everyone. Just giving it a few more minutes. All right, I think we everyone's come through. I just hate repeating myself. Here we go. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar is going to be in the following format. First, I will introduce our esteemed panelists. Then I will present on the legislative recap. Really, what are the new laws that are going to go into effect in California next year? We will have a moderated Q&A session. I myself am the moderator. And then we go into audience Q&A. Before we even start, thank you so much for joining us. I am Mohammed El Maldin. I'm a policy associate for UC Berkeley's Terner Center for Housing Innovation. And I'm joined here today by Nolan Gray. He is the Senior Director of Legislation and Research for California EMB and a licensed city planner. We also have Dante Golden, the Senior Director of Policy at the San Diego Housing Federation. And finally, we have Graciela Castillo-Krings, who is a partner at Sacramento Advocates and has over 20 years of legislative experience. Thank you all for joining us. And now we will begin with the presentation. So everyone's going to go cameras off, and we're just going to talk about California housing laws. All right, so the state of California passes about 60 plus bills per year that make it to the governor's desk, and he decides whether to sign or veto those bills. For this presentation, different from the paper that was published, we're going to focus on just the laws that will go into effect in 2025. If you want to know more about what the governor vetoed, feel free to read the research paper that will be linked in the chat. So welcome everyone. Next slide. Let us begin. So the legislature has seen a lot of advancements, a lot more expanding of what was previously passed in legislation before. So we're really looking at the first part, simplifying and accelerating housing development. Number one, SB 50, SB 450, which is not SB 50, SB 450, which is an expansion of SB 9, which really modifies the legal language. There were some county courts that decided that SB 9 does not apply to certain cities within the state. That is being appealed by the Attorney General's office and is now cleaned up through this legislation. There will also be a 60-day shot clock for permits. And now, similar to what Terner Center papers have found as a recommendation, is that SB 9 standards cannot be stricter than existing homes in the area. And if you want to read more about this, there are two papers written by myself truly that could be found on the paper that it was released recently. That's in the chat. We also had an expansion of SB 684, which is a bill that if you're in a multifamily zone, you could split the lot up to 10 times to build 10 homes, no matter what the zoning is. That was expanded into vacant lots in single family zones. We also had SB 937. The Terner Center has published maybe 5 different papers on the impact of impact fees. But this legislative change has made it that impact fees are charged at final inspection or certificate of occupancy, as long as that project has some affordable housing, like state density bonus law, or is under 10 units. The impact of this was measured by the Terner Center through our pro forma simulations, through our development math work, and we found that the likelihood of development increases by about 1% across the state. And that is due to developers not needing to borrow money to pay impact fees at the beginning of the project, which has interest and costs money that they could pay at the end of the project when homes are being occupied. We also found a Republican bill, Assemblymember Patterson, extended the expiration date for building entitlements by 18 months. Right now, with market conditions, people are unsure when they could start construction. This extends that time period by about 18 months just for market conditions to kind of settle so construction could begin. Yeah, building entitlements actually expire after you go through the whole process. Little known fact. And lastly, we saw an expansion of AB 1097, which through AB 2553, which expands major transit stops to 20-minute bus headways instead of what was previously required, which was about 15 minutes, and also lowers mitigation fees because if you're not doing car trips, why are you paying for traffic mitigation fees? Next slide. This year, we saw a lot of changes when it comes to housing enforcement, right? So there were cities that tried to self-certify their housing element. If you want to learn more about the housing element process and about the builder's remedy, feel free to click on the legislative recap. But what we see here is that only HCD or a court can declare a housing element in compliance. That takes away the cities. Some cities thought they had the ability to self-certify, which was now cleaned up through the legislative language. And the biggest bill this year when it comes to housing streamlining is really modifying the builder's remedy. The builder's remedy was a law that was written in the 1990s and found by Professor Elmendorf, which he promoted on Twitter, which made it everywhere, which is if cities are not reaching their housing goals, that you could have unlimited density as long as there's 20% affordability on a project site. That was modified for varying levels of affordability, a little bit less than 20%, but it's more stagnated. So it's different income levels or affordable housing levels when it comes to the new project, but also limits the density to about 3 times of what was allowed on the existing site. It also prohibits cities from rezoning or having excessive hearings to prevent builders' remedy projects. We also had AB 1037, which gives the AG's office new authority to impose civil penalties for local governments that fail to comply with housing requirements. These fees are up to $50,000 per month per unit. That will be charged to the local government if they find them non-compliant with housing law. And lastly, HCD and housing elements, the burden of proof was shifted by Quirk Silva's new law. Before, the state had to provide the burden of proof in court. Now it's local governments that has to have the burden of proof when they want to appeal what's going on within a housing element. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about homelessness. So earlier this year, Proposition 1 passed in a razor-thin margin, which appropriated about $6.4 billion in bonds to construct behavioral health treatment facilities and supportive housing. The legislature also followed the governor's orders and passed a few more bills when it comes to homelessness. There was AB 2835 by Assemblymember Gabriel, which makes it easier for people that are experiencing homelessness to stay in private motels for more than 350 days. The screen's being shared. Let's not show the attendees. For more than 30 days. Senator Blakespeare passed the Interim Housing Act, which extends CEQA exemptions for low barrier navigation centers, and sunsets at about 2036. And Senator Becker exempts local agency contracts for homelessness services from CEQA. So a lot of CEQA streamlining, a lot of more leniency when it comes to providers and providing services. Next slide. And now affordable housing and tenant protections. Senator Skinner did it. After about 2 years, local governments can now create their own regional housing finance agencies, similar to AB 1897, which established BAFA within the Bay Area. Now local cities can create their own regional housing finance agencies to promote affordable housing through bonds, grants, and voter-approved measures. There was also AB 2926, which allows basically developers to purchase properties easier that are about to term out of affordable housing. This saves about 500 to 1,000 affordable housing units from being kicked out of the system. Now they could be a part of the housing system and continue their affordability for a longer period of time. AB 1053 allows developers that receive HCD funds to start construction before waiting for certificate of occupancy. So like the delay of funds when it comes to projects, I was speaking to a few people and that saves affordable developers up to $1 million when it comes to building new affordable housing. And it's changing basically a housing finance protocol, right? How we do the capital stack when it comes to affordable housing projects. We also had AB 846, which expanded the renter protections within the state of California through AB 1482, just cause evictions, but also limits on how much rents could be increased to affordable housing projects that were financed through state LIHTC, those state low-income housing tax credits. And finally, we had a bill by Cholera, which extends the time for defendants in eviction cases to respond from 5 days to 10 days. And Assemblymember Ward made some fixes to the property welfare exemption. We will have a paper on the property welfare exemption in the coming months, but it is one of the few ways to create affordable housing without using tax credits provided at the state or federal levels. Next slide. I would be amiss to not mention that the governor himself has passed 2 executive orders, one focused on homelessness earlier this year, and also another executive order focused on affordable housing and allowing for more climate-friendly construction. So bringing the climate and housing crises closer together. We have 2 executive orders from the governor. We have Proposition 1 from earlier this year, and now we have the final legislation that we're going to be covering today, which is we're building on to ADUs. We're doing more with ADUs. Which was one of the great successes of California. So improves the flexibility for ADUs, allows up to 25% of units internally in a multifamily development that already exists to be converted into ADUs. So let's say you have 8 units and you have 2 common spaces. You could convert those 2 units into ADUs. Or you could add 8 detached units. So, or up to how many units there are already available on the site. So let's say you have a sixplex and you have parking in the back, you could build 6 ADUs in the back. So this increases the density of already existing multifamily housing units, and it's very beneficial for financing, right? If you own equity in a multifamily building, it's much easier for you to build an ADU than for a homeowner right now. We also have SB 1077, which California Coastal Commission with HCD has to develop a guidance document for local jurisdictions and drafting ADU elements. So really expanding more ADUs, hopefully into the coastal zone and preventing long time delays. We had a paper covering this earlier this year that was linked to the legislative recap, which you should read. That was posted in the comments. And lastly, expansions to ADU amnesty. A lot of our work in the equity of ADUs at the Terner Center really does address some of this work, which is that local governments must use methods to assess safety and cuts fees for lower resourced homeowners that want to bring their ADUs up to code. The housing crisis was so bad, and it still is, that people are informally building units, and this pretty much provides guidelines for people to bring their units online, and making sure that these units are safe and that people could live in. And there are just there's just a checklist of standards that units have to meet that are upfront, instead of dealing with a process and a lot of back and forth from local governments. Next slide. And here we are. Please subscribe to our monthly newsletter. You will be up to date on all of the latest research on what's going on at the Terner Center. We have so many interesting papers that are coming out right now. I cannot express this enough. And you can learn about more events like this. So go ahead, get your phone, scan that QR code, and we're about to hit the Q&A with our panelists. Thank you. Hello, 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 my esteemed panelists. And I apologize that your bios are a little short. I guess it's the election jitters. And I didn't want to, but anyway, I really want to know, like, after this presentation, these are all such amazing people. If you don't know any of these names or faces, I would be astounded. These are the movers and shakers in Sacramento. And as movers and shakers in Sacramento, I have to ask, how would you rate the laws this year in terms of effectiveness? It seems to me a little more quiet when it comes to California housing, but I would love to look each of your perspectives. Like 1 least effective, 10 most effective year. This isn't representative of your organizations, just your own personal feelings. No one wants to answer.
I'd give it like a solid 6. I think in the past legislative sessions, there's been bigger, more substantial policy reforms to land use. This just wasn't one of those years. In your report, Mohammed, I think you articulated it pretty well, with this being a year of cleanup, trying to amend existing law, get the kind of dust off of what's working and what's not working, and then try to make sure we have some more stringent policies on the book. So not a huge year, definitely some substantial changes, but I think nothing like we've seen in the past. I think there's no silver bullet or one quick fix. So I think the legislative leaders, capital insiders, and activists are really trying to create a legal framework to move the needle on housing. So I think that's what this year's looked like.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Dante's saying. This is going to be the 8th year that the legislature has really prioritized housing. And if you take a look over the course of the 8 years, I think there has been over 300 pieces of legislation that have been enacted. Some of them smaller, some of them bigger. And so I think when we think about it and put it into perspective, that's a lot of pieces of legislation. And the reality, it takes a little bit of time for us to figure out what are the levers that are working well and what are the tweaks that we have to do, right? And so we don't always get it right from the get-go. Think about ADU law and how long that has taken us to get it right. But now that we completely have unlocked it. And so I wouldn't actually just take it one year by year, because a lot of the laws that were signed are not actually in effect yet, right? They don't go into effect until January 1st. So it's going to take us a little bit of time to really understand and assess the effectiveness of each individual law.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe a 6.5. We made incremental progress, and to Graciella's point, right? I mean, rolling back a a sort of broken system that took 75 years to build is not going to happen in one ledge session. And but we did make important progress on a few tricky things, including impact fees. So that was, it seems like a small incremental step, but these are opening forays into much bigger conversations. And I think we've effectively teed up a potentially more ambitious session in 2025.
All right, definitely. And now going on to this thread, this question will be directly to you, Graciela. So California did pass these hundreds of housing laws, and we've kind of seen just kind of like a small tick up when it comes to housing construction. Why hasn't there been more of an impact?
Again, to what Nolan was also saying, right? It's going to take us a little bit of time. But the other thing is there are certain things we cannot control. So we pass all these great pieces of legislation and reform, and then interest rate went up, right? So borrowing money suddenly became so prohibitive that a lot of projects basically stalled. And so there are certain factors that California can account for, others we can't. And so again, interest rates going up really kind of put a damper on things. Things are starting to recover, so I'm hoping that we're going to see a little bit more of that. The other thing is, on the affordable housing side, think about, for example, we were not able to pass a housing bond this year. That means that a lot of the funding that was allocated even for this upcoming cycle we're done. We have no money in the state for affordable housing. So this up and down investment, it really makes it difficult for a developer to plan out and think about, right? I'm just going to put it in, when you think about retirement, and many people that are able to start saving now for the future. Imagine if I told you, hey, one day you're going to have a salary, and in 3 months you're not. How do you account for that over years? And so I think that lack of ability to predict and stability really impacts our ability to produce affordable housing. And just on the financing side, even for market rate developers, they don't know suddenly if to borrow is going to be 7% interest rate, and that's at the low end. That's going to make it really hard, even if we have a lot of good land use reform legislation on the books.
Yeah, I'll reinforce that. I mean, we're swimming upstream on some of these macro factors, which is tough. I would also say two other things. I mean, one, even in the best of cases, it takes time to go from a law passing to, a CFO being issued, right? I mean, in many cases, there's a 6-month delay for implementation. It takes time for the market to figure out that the law has changed. Not every type of housing is going to be like ADUs, where folks already knew what ADUs were and how to build them, and they could start building them almost as soon as laws started changing. With bills like AB 2011 or some of the housing element rezonings, those are going to take time to take effect. Now, I totally understand the urgency, right? We're in the middle of a crisis, and we do need to make sure that we're speeding up implementation, but there's going to be a little bit of delay. At California YIMBY, the way we think of it is like there's a spigot, and how do we get housing production scaled up? We've opened some of the valves on the spigot. We've, I think, done a lot of important work on streamlining of entitlement streamlining, of getting more CEQA exemptions for good infill mixed income projects. We've made some progress on liberalizing zoning rules that are blocking housing, but then we have, for example, costs remain very, very high in California. We have, just high building costs, high impact fees, et cetera. So, right, it's tough because we make progress on opening one of those valves, right, and then the other valves remain closed, or in some cases actually get even more closed because of local policy changes. So it's tough. We have to be doing everything all at once, which is tricky in this work.
Just to add one more piece to Nolan and Graciela's point, it's some of these issues we can't legislate, like interest rates going up or the cost of labor or construction materials. Some of that is just outside of our control. And if this was like a 6 out of 10 year for policy, it was about a 2 out of 10 for funding. The San Diego Housing Federation, we represent affordable housing developers in SoCal, primarily San Diego, and it was a tough year in the budget. The sector lost about 1.2 billion in funding across multiple different funding streams. We had prior commitments of last year met, which is great for a lot of us. To Graciela's point, knowing what's going to be in the pipeline next year is important for us. But 1 year and one-time commitments aren't enough to build our way out of this crisis. The state's at a dire strait for deed restricted units, about 2 million that we need, and it's really constraining a bunch of the It's a big constraint. So unless we get a funding mechanism going, we did get a bond this year. I know Bay Area folks had BAFA. They had a bond that didn't make it through. San Diego, we were looking at trying to get a bond on the ballot as well to try to get some funding, but this year was just not the best year to get us the needed resource to build our way out of this crisis.
No, definitely. I love these perspectives because I'm worried about legislators and also the general population feeling like, oh, we've already done so much. Like, why am I not seeing a change? And I think some of these need to be addressed sometime. At the same time, we have maybe like 30 more legislators coming in to the Capitol. We have a whole bunch of staffers coming in. A lot of them are attending this webinar. What do each of you think is missing in the housing space that should be part of the conversation next legislative session?
Yeah, I don't
Start
mind to
with Tom.
start.
Yeah.
So I think a few things. One is we've made a lot of progress on entitlement streamlining. So a lot of shot clocks there when you're actually getting the planning department's approval, but we still have a lot of delays with post-entitlement permitting and inspections. You have projects that can get entitled maybe in 30 days, and then they spend 6 months, a year, 2 years going from the initial filing of the application to actually having a COO. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And I think the experience of ED1 in Los Angeles reveals that you actually can get a lot more applications in and projects started if you just speed up some of that post-entitlement permitting. So we're looking into a lot of that. We know that's a priority for some of the leadership. I think we also are hoping to continue to drive a conversation around homeownership and especially starter homes and closing the racial wealth gap of getting more inherently affordable homes built. You know, when I talk to a lot of legislators and I say starter home, I think they still think of, you know, detached single family home on a 5,000 square foot lot with a 2-car garage, where a starter home in California in 2024 is going to look like a townhouse or a 2 or 3 bedroom condo. So anything we can do to allow for these sorts of small lot subdivisions, we've already made some progress on that. Anything we can do to remove the arbitrary barriers to homeownership, multifamily, so condos, you know, we're eager to work on that. I also think last thing really, I mean, there's a ton of different things I could propose, but more conversation around building codes and some of the other rules that are driving up costs to build in California. I think there's an interesting conversation happening around that. We started that conversation with single stair in recent years, and I'm curious to see where that goes.
Great response. Graciela, what's missing?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Infrastructure. And I'm talking about access to just providing sewer money, things like that. So think about AB 2011, which actually helped ministerially make access to commercial property or even office space that is being underutilized. A lot of the infrastructure that is planned around that area was never envisioned to actually support dense housing. And if we even take a jurisdiction, for example, like Sacramento, when you're dealing with, a lot of the infrastructure that is aging, it's 70 years old, 80 years old, we need to upgrade that. Where is that funding going to come from? So one of the concerns that I have been talking to a lot of local governments, especially local governments that are trying to build their share of housing, is how are we funding infrastructure? Who's helping with that? How do we actually unlock current parcels of land that need upgrades? That's a big impediment. And when you think about how we fund other things in the state, transportation is a good example. That has a dedicated funding source. We can disagree whether it's appropriate or not, but there's a dedicated funding source. The same thing goes to school funding or other type of infrastructure. When it comes to upgrades like sewer and water, things like that, local governments are kind of left to fend for themselves. And I think we're starting to appreciate that. Again, this is another area of law that we actually haven't considered. And now we're thinking, how do we actually allow for additional infrastructure to exist? How do we make sure that the funding is there so it can support pieces of legislation like 2011 and unlock that potential? And again, it's a difficult conversation to have when the state coffers are empty and we don't have other reforms currently available. And I know we might get to Prop 5, but that is one of the reasons I think these pieces of legislation are by themselves cannot accomplish all the other things that we need to do.
Yeah, I think just one more thought that came to my head is just a better consolidation of existing agencies responsible for doling out dollars. Of course, I'm affordable housing advocate, so I'm going to scream at the state for giving us more funding, but the existing the mechanism to go after funding is Byzantine and not cohesive at all. Developers have to go navigate HCD, Cal HFA, Strategic Growth Council, CIDLAC, TCAC. All these different funding pots have different application periods. All of those cost developers time, expenses. I think it's about $20 per new capital stack you try to get to your overall 6 to 7 pieces of capital. It's complicated. It doesn't make sense. Trying to get one application for all those entities is probably the best way forward. It's going to be hard to do, but again, having some clear guideline when you apply, try to get dollars out, just makes it faster, easier, and cheaper to build.
And if you want to learn more about the Byzantine system of which we fund affordable housing, feel free to read our 9% LIHTC housing study at the Terner Center, where we lay it out, because you'll be surprised. And I know we touched a little bit on implementation. So like, what are some of the biggest implementation challenges when it comes to these new housing laws? And how can we best prepare local governments?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've been trying to do a better job of this at California MB of doing more outreach to local governments. We put out more resources with partners trying to explain what our laws do. I would say a few big changes that will affect local planning practice next year. The first is, of course, the delayed impact fees for certain types of protected projects. You know, that might require changes to local workflows. So just making sure that you're adhering to that law. I would say this shift that we've started with SB 684 and SB 1123 toward ministerial subdivisions for these small lot projects of 10 or fewer units, that's a big shift in how we think about subdivisions, which have historically always been discretionary in California. And so sitting down and coming up with, hey, what are the objective standards that we're going to be assessing these projects against, and then making sure that planning departments are prepared to process those applications within the 60-day review shot clock. So that's a big change. Another thing too, it's small, but it's important, is more tracking of historic preservation designations. So of course, I think everybody on this call agrees there's a lot of properties in California that deserve heightened historic preservation protections. But something we've seen is, you know, as we've closed off some of these NIMBY mechanisms, folks have moved to try to misuse historic preservation to get certain neighborhoods designated in order to block laws like SB 9 or certain state density bonus projects. So there's going to be more reporting requirements around that, and the state's kind of keeping an eye on what's going on there.
Yeah, because for me, it's like, you know, we pass about 60 plus bills every year. And like a big change was like AB 1033. Your ADU could be for sale. And maybe like 2 local governments have adopted it. And I would talk to someone at local government. I'm like, are you going to implement AB 1033? They're like, what's that? You know? So I'm always curious as to like, we pass so many laws and how do we just bring everyone up to speed? I could go to the next question because I have a lot of them. Oh my God. And this is going to be, oh, this is a great one. What other industries or local governments need to do to make our housing laws more successful? We hinted at it a little bit when it came to interest rates at the federal level and local governments, but like, who else needs to catch up outside of legislation for us to see success in getting housing built?
I'll just say, you mentioned you regularly talk to local planning departments and they're surprised by new laws. I regularly talk to builders who bump into issues, and I'll say, hey, a law has been passed in the last 5 years providing you certain protections around this, or talk to homeowners of, hey, you now have certain opportunities to add additional housing. So, you know, again, it's really on us as the advocates to do a better job of explaining and sort of promoting the laws. But you know, if you're a small scale builder, market rate or affordable, tracking this stuff is really important to know, you know, what sorts of protections you might be afforded. And then, of course, continuing to share those experiences with the folks on this call, as well as your legislator, and explain to them, you know, in many cases, now that there's such an appetite around this issue, in many cases, legislators are sort of really, really eager to hear from housing providers and builders, you know, what's standing in the way of building the housing that our communities need. And so, you know, if you're in any sense involved in the production of housing, reach out. Your local, state, and legislators are probably eager to hear from you.
I think one of the other big things, I'm going to go back to lack of resources when it comes to local governments and the ability to actually do some of these larger projects, right? One of the things we think about, we don't have a dedicated funding source at the state level when it comes to affordable housing or housing in general. Even if we wanted to expand it to missing middle, that we don't have any ongoing source of funding, which makes it really difficult to plan. And so having something that is available, that would be great. The other thing I think that Nolan mentioned earlier is kind of going back and looking at all of the actual building codes and deciding, do they actually continue to make sense today? Is there a smarter way of building? Is there a different way of actually getting to the reduction of affordable housing and housing in general, right? So really looking at that, one of the things that sticks with me is Governor Brown asked me one time to get all the building codes from the 1970s. And it was literally just like a stack. And then he asked me to bring for him like it was a 2018 building codes. There were 3 boxes of them. And so when you actually compare that, right, and you're asking a developer to basically, for multifamily in particular, to do all of the different building codes, it can add up pretty quickly. And so the question is, how do we actually balance all of the needs that the state continues to have, all the different goals, like when it comes to energy efficient buildings, and also the building codes? How do we balance the 2 needs that we have? Because they should not be in siloed. We should be looking at this in a holistic way, right? And just to give an example, one of the things that recently happened was at the Energy Commission, a change was made that every new construction, whether it's an ADU or larger, would actually require solar. Is that the best way of doing about it? What are some, I mean, we just have to look at some of these policies as not just in a silo, like I said, but holistically, and trying to figure out, how do we balance the state's goal of clean, reliable energy that is moving us away from carbon intense sources, to actually also making sure we're doing environmental goals and housing at the same time. These should not be opposing goals.
Yeah, especially with the grid becoming a lot more green and most of our greenhouse gas emissions are from car trips, maybe we should find ways to incentivize more infill housing to lower our VMT. I totally agree with you. And we have a lot of research coming out on that topic. That's why make sure to sign up for our newsletter. Dante.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
first point, it's unless you're a policy wonk and you work in the legislature and you're an advocate, these laws are brand new to a lot of folks all the time. Unless you're paid to track this, it's really hard to stay updated. Developers reach out all the time and they're curious to know what's happening in Sacramento and what's passed. And they might not know that there's been a law in the books for 4 years that can solve the problem they've been dealing with right now. So it's a lot of just trying to stay plugged in. A lot of it is on our job as advocates to try to make sure that we are broadcasting what's new and what's out there. Terner Center, you all do great work. So I read your reports all the time when it comes out, Mohammed. So thank you for keeping us on track here. I think one other point too is the state can do a lot. The state should be funding more. It should be having a dedicated funding source to build our way out of this crisis. But local governments also need the resources. Here in San Diego, we don't have a local funding source that we can use to get us better marks to go after LIHTC and state grants and like federal grants. I know we're going to get into Prop 5 maybe later on, but if we have a reduction in the voter threshold to pass bonds, we can more easily dedicate resources locally to build our way out of this crisis. We ran Measure A here at the San Diego Housing Federation in 2020. It was a bond. It was going to get us about $900 million to go get us our kind of dedicated funding source. It passed with about 62%, but unfortunately it didn't actually pass because the voter threshold was just too high. So getting that threshold lowered is important in allowing the local governments to make a decision what they want to fund. There's infrastructure funding as well that goes out to local governments. So it's not just Prop 5 is about housing. It's trying to make it easier for the local communities to pass things that they want to, again, get away out of this crisis.
And let's go more into that question when it comes to affordable housing financing. So how do you envision like regional collaborations evolving in the light of the introduction of SB 440, where local governments can create their own regional housing agencies? You could talk about Prop 5 here too.
I'm curious initial thoughts, then I can chime on afterwards. I don't want to put you on the spot, Graciela.
No, so one of the things about trying to kind of have regional housing authorities is to try to pull more money, right? At the end of the day, is if you look at BAFA, what they were projecting to do was a $20 billion bond. And so the idea is we need large infrastructure and housing money at scale. And so sometimes the way of doing it, instead of having an individual city that might not have a large tax base or might not be able to actually have a lot of resources, by pulling a region that is actually sharing, right? Because a lot of the times we don't live in a type of society where people live in one city and work in one city. That is eventually what we want to get to, but we're not there right now. We have to recognize that a lot of the time is we live regionally. Somebody might work in the city next door, but have to commute there. So how do we actually pull the resources together to be able to have a bigger pot of funding? So that's really what has been happening, looking at housing more as a regional thing, and that way we can actually fund it more regionally. And so we've seen that in LA with La Casa, we've seen it in the Bay Area with the BAFA. And so the idea is, how do we allow local governments to come together and pool resources, right? Again, the reality is we have to recognize we are trying to throw as many tools as possible and or have as many tools as possible to try to solve this very complex issue.
I think one other point too is BAFA and La Casa were really hard political fights to get passed. So SB 440 is really just allowing local governments to not have to come pass a bill and negotiate and try to change state statute. It's allowing them to create this agency on their own without having to go through the political process in Sacramento. So it's a really good tool in our arsenal here.
All right. I was hoping a little bit more Prop 5 there, but we'll ask that question in a second.
We can go to Prop 5. So Prop 5
Yeah.
actually, again, to Dante's point, some of the tools that we're trying to give local governments to actually raise their own funding they're politically difficult. They're very difficult, right? And even Prop 5, right? It originally included special taxes that had to be removed. And so now Prop 5 allows local governments to basically say, yes, I'm going to pass a bond with 55% of the vote. That is the same type of authority school districts already have. And the reality is many of the bonds for infrastructure purposes, for things like just basic necessities that local governments need, they miss it by a smidge because we actually require them to have a supermajority. And the question is, again, if they're not able to change Prop 13, right? We're not have that ability. If they're not able to pass bonds, what are the tools that local governments actually have to provide the services that have to accompany housing? When we think about communities, we want communities that are walkable, that are enjoyable, that, I want to be able to walk outside and go to the park. Or I want to go out there and make sure that there's a lot of resources for communities. It's not just about building housing, it's building housing and community. Well, if we don't give locals the ability to raise their own funds, how do they get there? Especially when, again, the state is not providing tons of funding because the state doesn't have it either. So there's different tools. So Prop 5, if it passes, would simply give locals the ability to put a bond on the ballot and for the voters to decide by 55% if they're going to do it or not. That's it. It does not raise taxes. It just simply allows them to put a bond on the ballot and ask the question. So I think we just have to start thinking about what kind of communities we want to live in and how we're going to fund them.
To Gracio's point too, the state has really looked at local governments to solve this problem on their own, and it's been a bit difficult because local governments can't do that without this passing. It's unfortunate that we even have to finance affordable homes through bonds. There's another conversation about why that's even a policy on its own, but that's what we have now. That's the system we're using. So if this is the way we're going to be funding different affordable housing projects, then we need to be able to do that in an effective way. And Prop 5, again, just not going to pass any new taxes. It just allows local governments to adapt to the changing needs of their community.
And election is tomorrow, so, and we need to bring Nolan's voice into this a little bit too. What about the effects of Proposition 33? We could talk about Prop 5 a little bit more if you want to talk about that, but also Proposition 33. Terner Center does not have a position on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so California YIMBY has taken an opposed position on this. Of course, we support prudent protections for tenants, and I think there's definitely rent stabilization mechanisms that make a lot of sense. But with Prop 33, there's a reason why every local jurisdiction that wants to block housing is, licking their chops, looking at this proposition. It would potentially give local jurisdictions unlimited authority over how they set these policies, which could effectively be used to block new housing production. So we're opposed, and we hope that there will be more constructive conversations around rent stabilization in future legislative sessions.
Right, definitely. Go ahead.
position on this. I'm taking off my hat there, but it's I think everyone can agree Costa-Hawkins isn't the best law in the books. It's not really great. There's different ways we can go about trying to implement rent stabilization ordinances and laws statewide, but this kind of sledgehammer approach that Prop 33 is taking, it's not the most effective way to go about trying to stabilize folks living in housing. It's Again, we can have another conversation absent a prop about what we should do with the rent control and how that should be implemented statewide, but Prop 33 is it's a really big sledgehammer that local governments that don't want to do new housing are looking forward to do because they can attach high affordability requirements on projects and basically have no new housing being built. So to Nolan's point, it's kind of a Trojan horse here in ways that folks don't see it that way.
All right, and this will be the last question here before we open it to audience Q&A. And audience, feel free to ask Q&A in the Q&A box. If it's something about the presentation, I was limited to 10 minutes. Feel free to read the paper in the chat. And if you want to learn more about the actual bills, you could click on the bill number and read it yourself. If you have something that's a very complicated question that you're like, maybe a lawyer should answer this, please send it to a lawyer. Don't send it to me. The Terner Center is not liable for anything that happens with your developments or anything of the sorts, just because we might have had an interesting interpretation of a bill. Actually, I won't answer something unless I think a lawyer is the best person to ask. So please, other than that, put in your questions in the Q&A while we go over the last question, which is, how do you all think that recent legislative updates, SB 450, AB 2553, which is the expansion of the major transit stops, or SB 450, the cleanup of SB 9, will impact the housing production in high demand areas over the years? Right? And what is next for market rate housing development? We know affordable housing, we need more funding, we need a cleaned up system. But what's next for market rate housing? And if you have anything that's what's next for affordable housing, I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, well, on to SB 450, this is a really important step in the right direction. For those who don't remember, SB 9 was the legislature attempting to legalize duplexes and lot splits in residential districts statewide. A few other states have done something similar. Unfortunately, it looked a lot like when the state first tried to legalize ADUs, which is local governments in many cases have either not implemented the law or have actively tried to oppose it. Not all, but far too many. SB 450 closed a lot of the major loopholes, which was really positive. So the 60-day shot clock, prohibiting any standards that are much more restrictive than what would generally apply. So that's all good. A lot of jurisdictions are going to have to hopefully change their standards with SB 9 projects to be a little bit more workable. But we still have a lot of work to do there. I mean, maybe a theme of this panel is, our model here is like, we have a successful example of this, which is ADUs, and how do we get other housing laws such as SB 9 to work as well? Especially bringing it back to the homeownership piece, right? If we can get lot splits working and small lot homes working, that's something we're also trying to do with SB 684 and 1123. That's going to be a really, really valuable source of homeownership opportunities going forward. So still some work to do on that of getting SB 9 all the way there, but we're making important progress.
All right, let's go to audience questions. A lot of statements, need more questions. But my favorite question right here is actually, yeah, this is an anonymous attendee. Is there anyone looking at the frequency of building code changes? We have had affordable projects where by the time they've put together the financing, the building code has changed, requiring them to update their plans, adding more cost to the project.
Yeah, I've been hearing chatter about the potential for putting guardrails around how frequently building code updates occur, where there's not some overriding and urgent health and safety consideration. And I think that could be potentially a positive avenue of reform. There was a bill introduced last year to just generally look at building codes and say, hey, there's often very little financial assessment of changes. And so just going back and saying, okay, maybe how often do these changes need to occur? And then are we factoring in the actual housing affordability implications of these changes?
I think that's becoming a bigger topic in the legislature as well, right? People are starting to focus on what additional changes can actually be done to ensure that affordability at all levels is kind of maintained. So I think we should keep an ear to the ground. Something is brewing.
And I'll go to the next question. I'll direct this question to Dante and Graciela, which is both SF and LA has had regional finance agencies, as you've mentioned. Greg Foster is asking, any thoughts on the effectiveness of the programming for smaller, more rural authorities like Eureka, Arcata, Humboldt? Like, how do we make sure rural communities are not left behind?
That's a really good question. I know that is something that is coming up in terms of if the tax base is not going to be there for like rural areas, what is another way of helping support additional growth and housing? So that is something that is happening. In the past, there has been like more set asides in through the budget or something like that. That is something I'm not aware of. They're kind of getting together at a regional, or I'm sorry, more at a rural, but it's something that we could look into. I don't know if Dante, if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's just tough if the tax base isn't there necessarily, and that's where we look towards the state to come in here and help out, given that the state just has way more autonomy and the coffers are a lot bigger. That's a good question, though. I'm going to table this and think about this and come back to some folks and chat about what's happening out there in rural areas. LA and SF are big metros, and they have the ability to fund whatever they want to fund if the voters pass it. So yeah, this is a problem I haven't really came across yet.
I do love all the questions complaining about utilities and post entitlement. You are heard. Please do not put in any more. There was an interesting question from Heather Ronkow, which is how do you get the government to allow pilots with new laws before they become statewide? Because I am hearing from local governments that like they are wary of experimenting with new things because they are always worried about breaking new state laws. So this is an interesting question.
So the question is, how do you pilot before they become state law? A lot of
Yeah.
the times, legislation can also be passed to do pilot programs as opposed to statewide changes. So that's another thing that can happen. And just to see, we see that often, right? 3 jurisdictions get together and say, we're going to do a small pilot program and then see, and if it has merits, then we'll expand it. So that could be another thing. It doesn't always have to be statewide.
Yeah, I think since this theme is about ADUs, ADU was like the prime example of letting local governments experiment with what works for them. Out here in San Diego, there's a really successful program called the ADU Home Density Program, where it allows you to do a one-for-one affordable deed-restricted unit that's an ADU, and then match that with a market rate one, and that's been super successful out here. I think the Terner Center has written about that one as well in the past. So it's pretty common, it feels like, to let jurisdictions experiment, and it's been successful in certain areas of law.
Yeah, and SB 10, Dante might, have PTSD from SB 10, but down in San Diego. But SB 10 does carve out a framework where local jurisdictions have a lot of flexibility to adopt missing middle rezonings and be exempt from CEQA. And so, that's an area where there could be a little bit more experimentation without necessarily having to do all the typical process associated with zoning changes in particular.
I'm getting war flashbacks from SB 10 fights. No one takes
Yeah, another question from Jaron Brandon. SB 35 has exempted high fire risk areas, effectively making housing growth with public funds extremely challenging in mountain areas. Does an updated standard need to be created for building in fire-prone areas to maintain eligibility? Like, is there a pathway outside of high fire risk? Is there a pathway for high fire risk areas to build housing if they want to?
Well, Graciela and I have probably had like dozens of hours of conversations about the SB 35 exclusions. So I'll say my piece. There's SB 423 carried forward a lot of that language. There's still the opportunity to have a fire hazard mitigation measure plan adopted. I would say too, there were a lot of conversations this past session around a bill called SB 610, which is potentially going to it fail, but it'll likely come back next session, of changing how we map and designate fire risk and what that means for housing. And that's going to influence a whole bunch of laws that are built off of this. So I would just say stay tuned.
And I think that we can build in those areas as long as that the buildings are up to code and there's certain things that they have to follow. But I think the biggest issue, whether we build in some areas or not, is access or lack thereof of insurance. At the end of the day, you can't even get a loan if you can't get insurance, right? Which means if you don't have a loan, then you can't actually get anything built. So the bigger issue I think that is facing the state, yes, there's definitely going to be some things about legislation and things that we need to kind of address. But at the end of the bigger issue is insurance. And what we're going to do. That's the everybody from multifamily to single family homes, everyone is starting to kind of really understand what that means, not just for people that have premiums that are going to be so expensive, but whether we actually can continue to build. So that to me is the bigger issue.
So I scrolled past this question. I can't find it right now. But what could be done to help fix the insurance issue in California?
Such a
I
big.
think Dante?
No. It's
It's
right.
Look, at the end of the day, I think we have to acknowledge that climate change is impacting how we actually grow and build in California. Not that we're going to stop, right? We need to figure this out, but it does actually bring to bear. We have to be more. We have to be realistic with some of the land use decisions that we're making. And infill is a perfect way of actually creating additional mitigation. It is, I think that's one of the reasons that the governor, and I think a lot of the folks on the call will recognize that housing is climate policy and climate policy is housing, right? And so how do we actually continue to make it easier to build in infill? And I will say, even on the fire question with, in conversations with CAL FIRE, one of the things that they were talking about, let's take, for example, Tahoe, or an area that might be more prone to fires, they were saying that additional building could actually create more resiliency for those communities because, one, by keeping them closer, it's easier to defend, it's easier to actually, for the brand new construction, which is basically going to reflect more of the updated codes to keep that community safe. Right. So if you have if you think of building a brand new perimeter of brand new construction in areas that are, it's an existing community, that makes it easier to defend. And so I think we have some real difficult, the solutions are not easy. And we just have to acknowledge that that is the reality.
I think one.
Okay, go ahead.
One other piece on the affordable side, absent me begging for more public funding throughout this entire call, I think trying to figure out how to best streamline the Surplus Lands Act is going to be important in the next couple of sessions. Our coalition has worked on AB 480 in the past, and we worked with Senator Caballero's office, SB 747, to try to streamline the SLA. Surplus Lands Act is basically when public land is no longer needed, the agency has to give a first right of refusal or to affordable housing developers. A notice goes out so developers can bid on it and you can go through a negotiation period. It's led to about 20,000 units being created over the last, I think, like 10 years. So trying to streamline that process is going to be pretty important for the next couple of years. It's somewhat difficult for affordable housing developers to go through the negotiation period. Local governments also have their own needs around economic development that always seem to be in contention sometimes with affordable housing development. So trying to streamline how we can use public land that's available and throughout California is going to be a conversation to be had too in the coming years.
Okay, I have two questions. These are really good questions. One will be for Dante and Graciela. One will be for Nolan. Okay, and then we're going to end this webinar. And I'm combining a bunch of questions here, which is for you two. What else could we do other than bonds to fund affordable housing? It seems like the elephant in the room is Proposition 13. What else could the state do in a Prop 13 environment to fund more housing, infrastructure, et cetera? Grouping together like 5 questions on this one.
I can try to be quick. I think transfer taxes are going to be the thing that it's going to be a lot of movement. We've seen that through Measure ULA. How you draft the transfer tax is important. You don't want to stifle new production, especially of apartment buildings. So going through the details is important, but absent bonds, trying to look at different tax mechanisms that are ongoing and permanent is kind of the need. I get irritated for bonds because money runs out at some point. So I think stay on the lookout for new transfer taxes. Again, drafting of that is important, so we can talk about that later on in another webinar.
Yeah. Measure E and San Jose versus UIHLA. Anyway,
At the end of the day, what Dante is saying is taxes or fees, 2/3 votes, or we can basically say we're going to have a portion of the general fund allocated for housing. But again, all of that requires additional changes that are going to be very difficult politically. But the reality is there's only so much money unless we're going to increase that amount through fees or taxes 2/3. So I know we're at time, so I'm going to stop.
Yeah. All right. And for Nolan, number one, how does Prop 33 give cities ways to block new development? And number two, what can legislatures do to ensure that cities are held accountable by the state for their RENA obligations and housing elements if they pass Prop 33-like measures?
To the second question, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, we'll be in a completely new policymaking environment. I don't know how HCD would interpret a housing element in a context where a strict rent control ordinance that applies to new construction has been adopted. I would hope that they would require much stricter measures, but we don't know. Second is the simple fact that this completely eliminates all state oversight over this very sensitive and tricky policy area. And so a local jurisdiction could just immediately impose rent control on relatively new construction and make it financially infeasible to build mixed income or market rate housing, or even cause potential issues for affordable housing development. So it's too open-ended, it's too vague, there's too much risk here. There's a reason why all the folks in the state who are most opposed to housing are supporting this. And again, we hope to see a much more constructive and collaborative conversation around rent stabilization in future sessions.
On time. Thank you so much for our esteemed panelists for coming here today and speaking on these issues and informing us so much about the new California housing laws that will come into effect in 2025. Tomorrow's election day. There are a number of propositions to vote for. There are a number of things that you can vote for at the local and state levels that do determine housing policy. And I want to thank our panelists so much for joining us. And thank you so much for our webinar attendees for sitting and listening to a webinar and learning more. Thank you for improving yourselves, and thank you for joining this webinar. Thank you. I wish I could clap for all of you. I love this.